Okay, so what we're going to do in this session is try and just to look at actually what happened from a historical perspective. We also hopefully have a look at how the Christadelphian community responded to the events that unfolded and how the Brotherhood looked at these things. And hopefully throughout the whole of this, you'll bear in mind what we thought about in our first study, which was that the Jews have to be in Jerusalem for the prophecies of the restoration of the kingdom to be fulfilled. They have to be there. And so this is most remarkable. Now, just before we go into some videos, I just want to recap on a little bit of history, okay, so that if you're not that familiar with the history of Jerusalem, these things hopefully will come in useful just to set the context. So if you go to Wikipedia, it will tell you about Jerusalem's historic periods, okay? So the Lord Jesus Christ was around here in the middle. You might be able to just about make out the Romans there in the sort of yellow and then red. And Jerusalem was actually conquered from the Roman power. That's the power that scattered Israel in AD 70 from the Romans in about 638 by the Muslim Arab rulership. Okay, and that kind of rulership has different names, but in essence it evolved into what we call the Ottomans. And so what we're going to be doing is focusing down here, the last kind of final few moments of that kind of Arab Muslim rule of the city of Jerusalem. Now, at the time of Elpis Israel, when Brother Thomas walked the earth, this is what the Middle East looked like. Okay, it was controlled by the Ottoman power, the Ottoman Empire, and it's a remarkable thing to note that in World War I, that one of the things that happened in the Middle East was that General Allenby, the British general who led the army in World War I in the Middle East, he and the army captured and beat back and pushed out the Ottomans, answering to Daniel chapter 11 verse 40, the king of the south, the power that controlled Egypt, would push out the king that was in the Middle East and push against him. And Revelation 16 verse 12, if you're into your prophecy, which talked about the great river Euphrates drying up. So they're two amazing prophecies that were fulfilled then. And he liberates Jerusalem from Arab rule, and there he is, he gets off his horse and walks into Jerusalem. And it's worthy of note that that was 100 years ago. Now suddenly we think, oh, hang on. 50 years ago, Jerusalem is liberated from Arabs. 100 years ago, the British liberated it again. So, maybe there's a pattern here. So I know in the Bible magazine, Brother Paul Billington's with us for a few more moments, there were some articles on this recently, and it's just interesting to note that maybe 2017 falls into this pattern of Jubilee periods, of 50-year periods. And we know our God is a God that works in patterns. So let's keep our ears to the ground, brothers and sisters and young people. Maybe this year is of more significance than perhaps we realise. So that was 100 years ago. Now, what happened? Well, the British kicked out the Ottomans and gained control. And eventually the United Nations, in their benevolence, decided to give control of Palestine, as they called it then, to the British. They called it the British Mandate. And they got that mainly because the British obviously had been involved in beating out the Ottomans. But interestingly, just before that happened in December, was this in December? The Balfour Declaration was 2nd of December, wasn't it? It's your birthday. November. Your birthday. Well, the day for King's birthday. The Balfour Declaration was issued. Sure, we're all familiar with the Balfour Declaration. It basically said that the British government would help the Jews, the Zionist movement, go back and have a place in the land of Israel. And so when they had the mandate for Palestine by the League of Nations, as it was called then, I think it's quite amusing. It says that tutelage of such people should be entrusted to advanced nations. That's us. Yeah, we were advanced. And then it says, certain communities formerly belonging to the Turkish Empire have reached a stage of development where their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized, subject to the rendering of administrative advice and assistance by a mandatory until such a time as they are able to stand alone. So the British were going to control that until the peoples previously been in the Ottoman power could stand on their own 2 feet. Then it was said that the British would withdraw. That was the mandate given to them. So what did the British do? Well, I also think it's quite amusing because they kind of like literally got a napkin and sort of drew out these lines that have no bearing on any landmarks, just straight across territories. The British really, they are quite peculiar people, aren't they? Very strange. And so no bearing on what's on the ground. And what they decided was, originally, was, hey, do you know what? We've said to the Jews we're going to help them get back to their land. And also we've got this Arab population. So what we'll do is we'll be fair and we'll give the Arabs most of it and then we'll give the Jews this little bit on the coast here. That should please everybody, but it didn't. What eventually happened was they decided to kind of divvy it up even more and give the Jews like the really lesser parts where there wasn't many populations at all. And so Israel the Jews had to make do with this little kind of area here. Jerusalem was to be, supposed to be an international city. Anyway, in 1948, the British decided to withdraw. And straight away, in accordance with the mandate, Israel said, hey, we're a nation now, we can stand on our own 2 feet, we're going to declare ourselves a state. The state of Israel was born, and Ben-Gurion read out the statements around independence. Immediately, at that time, the Arab nations around decided that they weren't happy with this and decided to attack, as we know. And so the War of Independence occurred. And actually what happened was that Jerusalem didn't end up being an international kind of city. The Jordanians took over it. The Egyptians took over the Gaza Strip on the left-hand side, and basically everyone attacked the newly formed territory. But as we know, it's not our subject today, but it was kind of another miraculous defence of borders took place, and the state of Israel survived. We're going to fast forward a little bit to the Sinai War, and this, I had to really put this in, because I was like, should I put this in? But I had to put this in because there's some incidents that take place in this war which then impact on the 1967 war, which we're coming to. So what happened in that time? Well, over the period of all those times, the Arab nations, they just didn't believe that Israel should exist. Okay, you can't negotiate. They didn't want to negotiate. They just want them to be pushed into the sea, is a phrase that they use quite a bit. And there's this Egyptian guy, Nasser, he comes to power, and he gets a bit big for his boots. Okay, so what he decides is that the Suez Canal, which was owned by the British and the French, he says, you know what, this is my canal, this is the Egyptian canal, we're going to take it back. So he decides to nationalise the Suez Canal, which of course the British and the French, who were quite powerful at the time, thought, hey, this is our canal. So they were a bit upset. Also at that time, the Egyptians were shooting at Israel. They were just taking pot shots all the time over the border. So the Israelis, the British and the French got together in secret and they said, well, we can't have this. Nasser is getting a bit big for his boots. Nasser also decides not only to take back the Suez Canal, but to block off here the Gulf of Aqaba, which is where, you see the bottom of Israel there, there's a lot of trade that comes in and out there. There's a vital port in Eilat for Israel to maintain. So that upset the Israelis, obviously. So what happens then? So they put you see this bottom picture here, this is a big gun that they put over that section there, and they just shoot at any ship that came by. Pretty annoying. So, the Israelis came, they took over the Sinai Peninsula, and they held right to the bank of the Suez Canal. And then the British and the French got their troops in as well to help them out and bombed some key areas. And then the Israelis also took out those guns so that they could actually have their shipping lane back. But the international community went into uproar, like, oh my goodness, what is happening? And they put pressure on Britain and France to withdraw from that area. And so Israel was kind of left a little bit in the lurch, but they also said that they'd withdraw. And the United Nations says, don't worry everybody, we're going to come in and we're going to hold the peace. So the United Nations put their troops in this buffer zone to stop the Egyptians taking pot shots at the Israelis, and the blockade was agreed the blockade would never come back and that Israel could have that as a shipping port. And everybody sort of had this uneasy truce. So that's kind of sets the scene now for what happens in 1967. This uneasy truce was in place. The Arab nations, they hated Israel, they didn't want Israel to exist. And now we're going to watch a series of videos, and I'm going to pop up every now and again and probably annoy you a little bit, because I'm not as exciting as what takes place, but you'll have to bear with me. The videos, we just want to be clear, we didn't make them. They're from Jerusalem U, from that URL there. So we just want to be clear about that, but we're using them here obviously for educational purposes, so hopefully that'll be okay. So this is the first one, and it just sets the scene a little bit.
The Six-Day War of 1967 was a pivotal event in the history of the Middle East. In the weeks leading up to the war, 4 Arab armies gathered near Israel's borders, openly threatening the annihilation of the Jewish state. Yet in only 6 days, Israel pushed these armies back and captured new territory that made it much less vulnerable to future attacks. After the war, Israel offered to trade much of this land for peace with the Arab countries, but they refused to negotiate peace with Israel. Many of the dilemmas that Israel faces today had their beginnings at this critical time. In this series of video posts over the next month, we will relive these dramatic events that took place 50 years ago today. In May of 1967, Israel stood in a precarious position. It was not the strong country that it is today. Only 19 years earlier, it had barely survived its war of independence. In that war, 5 Arab armies had simultaneously invaded in an effort to prevent the creation of a Jewish state. Yet the Israelis fought back and were able to reclaim sovereignty over their ancient homeland, establishing a nation-state for the Jewish people after 2,000 years of exile and periods of persecution. The War of Independence ended in 1949, but Arab rejection of Israel had produced continued terrorism from 3 borders. To Israel's north, from the Golan Heights, Syria shelled Jewish communities in the valley below on a regular basis. In the south and east, Arab terrorists from the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip and the Jordanian-controlled West Bank regularly infiltrated across the border, carrying out attacks against civilians and killing over 400 Israelis over the course of 19 years. At its narrowest point, Israel was only 9 miles wide and vulnerable to an attack from Jordan that could cut the country in half. Its supply of water was also under threat. Beginning in 1964, the Syrians had been trying to divert the flow of Israel's critical water source, the Jordan River. On May 11th, after a series of terrorist attacks, UN Secretary General U Thant stated that attacks on Israel were, quote, deplorable, insidious, contrary to the letter and spirit of the armistice agreements, and menaces to peace in the area. Israel had faced these threats since its birth. Long before the Six-Day War and before Israel had control of the West Bank, its Arab neighbors had rejected Israel's right to exist. To the Arab world, Israel's borders, the ceasefire lines of 1949, were simply the points where the war was paused, to be resumed at any moment. That moment was approaching. The week of May 14th, 1967. On May 11th, the United Nations had condemned Arab attacks on Israel as deplorable and menaces to peace. But rather than calming the situation, Arab states were about to escalate the conflict. On May 14th, Egypt's President Nasser began moving his troops and armor into the Sinai Peninsula, the only buffer zone between Egypt and Israel. Since the 1956 Suez War, this area had already been demilitarized with UN troops stationed along the Egypt-Israel border to help maintain the peace. Nasser's initial decision to move troops and armor into Sinai was in part fueled by false information supplied by the Soviet Union, Egypt's ally and sponsor, that claimed Israel was about to invade Syria. Within a day, Nasser learned that the claim was false, but chose to continue with the military buildup threatening Israel. On May 16th, goaded on by other Arab countries and the Egyptian public, and urged to not, quote, hide behind UN skirts, Nasser ordered the UN troops to immediately evacuate the Sinai. To the bewilderment of the international community, the UN acquiesced and simply left. Israel now lay exposed on its southern border as Egypt continued amassing its troops in the Sinai. By the end of the week, Egypt had moved 80,000 troops, 550 tanks, and 1,000 artillery pieces towards the Israeli border. On May 18th, government-controlled Cairo radio made Egypt's intentions clear.
As of today, there no longer exists an international emergency force to protect Israel. The sole method we shall apply against Israel is a total war which will result in the extermination of Zionist existence.
War seemed inevitable. The week of May 23rd, 1967. The previous week, Egypt had moved 80,000 troops, 550 tanks, and 1,000 artillery pieces into the Sinai, the buffer zone between Egypt and Israel, and expelled the UN force intended to keep the peace. Israel began defensive preparations but sought international diplomacy to avert the crisis. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol stated that Israel would not initiate hostilities unless Egyptian forces closed the international waterway leading to Israel's southern port. Its closure would shut down Israel's supply of oil and other vital resources and block access of Israeli ships to the east. On May 23rd, President Nasser did just that and blockaded the Straits of Tiran, leading to the Gulf of Aqaba and cutting off shipping to Israel's southern port of Eilat. This action violated UN Security Council Resolution 118, was condemned by US President Johnson, and constituted a casus belli, an internationally recognized act of war. Yet Israel refrained from taking any military action, still preferring a diplomatic solution to the conflict. But from Nasser's statements and from public opinion of the Arab masses inflamed with the prospect of destroying Israel, it seemed that a diplomatic solution was not going to be an option.
We knew that closing the Gulf of Aqaba meant war with Israel. If war comes, it will be total, and the objective will be Israel's destruction.
5 other Arab countries rallied around Nasser and sent their troops to the front lines. War seemed imminent.
Situation for the people of Israel. Imagine what it would have been like to be a Jew at that time. You know, even if you weren't in Israel, it would have been a terrifying situation, and like another Holocaust is about to happen. Imagine what it would have been like to be in the Christadelphian community at that time. You know, would that have caused us doubts to think, oh, crumbs, maybe we were wrong about the Jews having to be in Jerusalem, because all the odds were stacked against Israel. In fact, this is what it kind of looked like. Nasser proclaims he will not agree to free sea passage. You know, things were really looking pretty bad. Israel was starved of that trade in oil from the south. And if you looked at the stats at the time, it looked like Israel was, by far, less troops, definitely in terms of regular professional army soldiers. They had about 50,000 regulars. They had far less aircraft. Now, obviously, aircraft is massively significant in modern warfare. Not that I'm an expert, but obviously, if you can control the skies, you can get places quicker. You can attack people and areas quicker. So, the aircraft is massively a massive problem, and even tanks. They didn't have that many tanks compared to the might of the Arab nations around them. So, that's just something we might come back to in a minute. So, let's see what actually unfolded now in day one of the 6-day war.
June 5th, 1967, day one of the war. In the early morning of June 5th, Israel launched a preemptive attack on Egyptian Air Force bases. The Israeli Air Force had come up with a bold, risky, and complex plan involving all but 12 of their approximately 250 jets. The plan required dozens of Israeli squadrons from different bases to rendezvous silently over 11 Egyptian air bases. The first Israeli planes took off at 7:10 a.m., flying low to avoid radar detection and observing complete radio silence. They began the surprise attack before the Egyptian pilots could scramble and get their jets in the air. After first bombing the runway so that they could not be used, Israeli jets bombed and strafed Egypt's combat aircraft on the ground. In a matter of 4 hours, Israel destroyed 2/3 of the entire Egyptian Air Force, the largest in the Arab world. This singular act gave Israel control of the airspace over southern Israel, Egypt, and Sinai, providing a great advantage on the southern front and freeing Israel's Air Force for use on other fronts. A preemptive strike had not been taken lightly. Israel had determined that the 200,000 Arab troops and 1,000 tanks gathered near Israel's borders were poised for action, with the goal of destroying Israel. If Israel were to wait for a coordinated Arab strike on all its borders, the future of the country would be at great risk and casualties would be massive. Immediately after the attack on the Egyptian bases, the Israelis sent a message to King Hussein of Jordan, saying that Israel would not attack Jordan if Jordan stayed out of the war, even though it meant that the Jewish holy sites of Jerusalem would remain under Jordanian control, inaccessible to Jews. But Jordan had received false information from Egypt claiming massive successful attacks against Israel. Reassured of Arab victory, Jordan rebuffed Israel's offer and launched multiple attacks on Israel. Thousands of mortar shells rained down on Jewish areas of West Jerusalem, hitting civilian locations indiscriminately, including Hadassah Hospital and Mount Zion Church. Because of Israel's narrow 9-mile waistline and Jordanian control of the strategic high ground of the West Bank, Jordan easily shelled civilian locations all the way to Tel Aviv and carried out airstrikes against the coastal communities of Netanya and Kfar Saba. Jordan had aggressively entered the war. Next, Syria and Iraq joined the war by launching attacks inside Israel. Syrian planes attacked Haifa's oil refineries but were destroyed by Israeli forces. They also continued with artillery and heavy machine gun fire on northern Israel and carried out attacks in the valley below the Golan. Later in the afternoon, Israeli jets responded by attacking Jordanian, Syrian, and Iraqi air bases. Without the element of surprise, they experienced a number of losses, but succeeded in doing great damage to all three Arab air forces. But Israel was still outnumbered and outgunned, taxing the limits of its small military. Despite its efforts to avoid war in the West Bank and Jerusalem, Israel found itself drawn into a war on 3 fronts, a situation that would ultimately reshape the map of Israel.
So, it all kicks off. The Israelis, obviously, they're facing this massive situation where it looks like they're going to be crushed. They decide to take the first move. I mean, in effect, Egypt had declared war by shutting off the Gulf of Aqaba and mounting all the troops to the borders. So they had nothing to lose. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, 7:15, the jets take off. You might have heard from the first video. They called this Operation Moked, Operation Focus, because they were going to focus on the Egyptian airfields. They were going to stop their planes taking off. That was the plan. They managed to get there without being detected. They managed to bomb the runways, and then they were able to kind of destroy most of the planes. Interestingly, in that first wave, they only lost about 8 planes, but Egypt lost 200 planes in that first wave. Further raids were then undertaken, and later in the day, they decided to extend the operation to Jordanian and Syrian airfields. The Syrians, as you saw in that video, the Jordanians were told, look, keep out of this. The Israelis said, look, if you just stay over there and be quiet, we won't come for you. But the Egyptians as you'll see, is a common theme in this story, decided to start telling everybody how amazing victory that they were having when in fact all their planes had just been destroyed. So the Jordanians are like, well, we are going to join this, we're going to join this attack. So they decided to join. A bit silly, really. So here's some of the pictures from that day. There's some Israeli jets. The amazing success was heralded by those involved. Mordecai Motti Hood said, even in my wildest dreams, I could not have imagined such an achievement. And we could have spent all day looking at testimonials from the people that took part in those. He said, it was amazing. We completely surprised them. All the missions were completed. All of us were alive. I think that's quite a significant comment there. Anti-aircraft fire was pathetic. This is another guy that took part in the first wave. He says, in the first wave, I led a formation of 4 Mirages on Amashus Airport, at the entrance of Cairo. 42 MiG-21 jets, the most advanced Soviet interception planes, are poised for immediate takeoff. Not one of them managed to move. A complete surprise. By the time we were done, all of the MiGs were burning on the parking area. We landed back at the base with our last drops of fuel, and to our great joy, we saw no one had been hurt. Now, I want to just point out some of the reasons as to why this was such a great success. We might just think, hey, maybe the Israelis, they're like really good at flying planes. Maybe they're just clever, right? But that is not the case. There's 3 incredible things that happened in that slot between 7 and 8 a.m. on that first day. And the most amazing thing about it was that none of these 3 things were known by Israeli intelligence. So these are coincidences. And when we come across coincidences to this magnitude, I would suggest they're not coincidences at all. They're actually miracles. It's got the hallmarks of our God. So, what are they? Well, 7:15, right? The planes take off. They're flying low. They're going across the Mediterranean, and they're going to turn south into Egypt. And at that time, there was a Jordanian guy looking at the radar, in Jordan. Now, Jordan had been placed under Egyptian army control. So his kind of boss was an Egyptian. So he sees these, he actually sees on the radar all these dots kind of appear. They're flying low, they're trying to not be seen, but some of them appeared. So he thought, right, oh crumbs, they're actually going to attack. So he sends a message to Egyptian headquarters, and he says, attack, you're going to be attacked. And they get this message, and they're like, what does that mean? So he sends it again, attack, you're being attacked. And they're like, oh, shut up. And they turn him off. And then suddenly they think, hey, do you know what, last night, didn't we just change the codes? Like maybe he's using yesterday's codes, maybe the codes didn't go through to him, this guy on the radar. And so that by the time that they figured this out, he was using yesterday's codes, and they'd stopped using them, and it was saying attack, it was too late. So that's a little coincidence, isn't it, that took place, because had they had that message through, they would have got a bit more ready. And so I would say that's an amazing coincidence that that stupidity was allowed to happen. Secondly, right, the night before, just so happened that the night before, in a few of the bases, they had decided to throw a belly dancing party, right? To boost the morale of the troops, because the Arabs were so confident. So they had a party, and they invited all of the pilots, or at least the chief pilots, to the party, and they drank a lot. And there was this particular pilot from the Arab side, and he was supposed to fly a little recon mission at 7:30. He was supposed to be out, just checking they used to just go up and down the Mediterranean and then come back, and then another wave would go up and down, just a few of them, just to check out what the Israelis were doing. But the one that was supposed to just set off at 7:30, he was a bit late because he had a bit of a hangover. So an amazing coincidence that he never actually took off. I think by the time he came, his airstrip was actually all blown up. So never be late is the message from that one. What about the other thing? Well, this one is truly remarkable, right? So the Egyptian High Command decides, we're going to all get together, we're going to get on a little plane, and we're going to just bob around, and we're going to have a look at how our defences are doing, ready, because bear in mind they're getting ready to attack Israel. So this chief officer, he says, well, to all the anti-aircraft people, the gunners, right, guys, no firing between the hours of 7 and 8, because we're the top brass, we're all going to be up there, don't want any mistakes, because that's going to be bad. So everybody just don't do anything. So they decided to all go for breakfast, because they weren't allowed to fire. He said, though, only if I personally tell you to fire, then you can kind of fire. But me personally. So he's up in the air, bobbing around, and they're just checking out, I think, the defences towards Israel's southern front. That's the Egyptian high command. Now, again, that's an amazing coincidence, isn't it? That the anti-aircraft gunners, who that fighter said were pathetic, one of the reasons they were pathetic because they weren't actually supposed to fire anything, because they're like, when they saw the planes come over, they're like, well, what do I do? Do I fire? I've been commanded not to fire. But then they're bombing us, but like, what do I do? Can I fire? Can I not fire? And then eventually someone will say, just fire, and then but it's too late. So an amazing situation that God arranged to happen so that Israel could have this early victory. The first 6 hours, they say it was won, not in 6 days, because by the time the Israelis were done, they had supreme air authority over all of the territories. So the newspapers, Air Force wins supremacy as army drives Egyptians back into Sinai and Gaza. We see there the report that Jordan was shelling Jerusalem at that time. Aircraft stats are quite interesting. I mean, these are approximate, depends which source you look at, but roughly speaking, the aircraft were obviously far more in the Arab favour. At the end of it, Israel did suffer quite a lot of casualties, really. Almost a quarter of their air force was destroyed, but the Arabs suffered a lot more. So that was day one. A truly remarkable victory for Israel. So we're going to watch a few more then and see what unfolds as time goes on.
June 6th, 1967, day 2 of the war. Having destroyed 2/3 of the Egyptian Air Force the previous day, Israeli forces now engaged Egyptian tanks and ground troops positioned to attack Israel. Israeli tanks swept through the Sinai Desert and would defeat Egypt's armored divisions despite Israeli tanks being outnumbered 3-1. Egyptian General Amer, realizing the extent of his defeat, ordered a retreat. Most of the Sinai was now in Israel's hands. By noon the next day, Israel would capture the port of Sharm el-Sheikh. This allowed Israel to reopen the sea lanes that Egypt had blockaded 2 weeks earlier in an act of war. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Israeli troops dashed through the Jordanian-held sector of Jerusalem and reached the strategic high point of Mount Scopus, overlooking the Old City. They were at a disadvantage. Israeli forces would not use artillery on the Jordanian troops in the Old City because of its historic and religious significance to Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. In an emergency session at the United Nations in New York, Abba Eban, Israel's foreign minister, addressed the UN Security Council.
Israel had reached a somber hour. An army greater than any force ever assembled in history in Sinai had massed against Israel's southern frontier. Nasser had provocatively brought 5 infantry divisions and 2 armored divisions up to our very gates. 80,000 men and 900 tanks were poised to move.
As the attacks on Israel continued, Israeli Prime Minister Eshkol appealed to the Soviets, who were supporting Egypt, to help secure peace. But the Soviet Union demanded that Israel immediately and unconditionally halt all military operations, an option Israel could not afford while still being attacked. The war was not yet over.
Okay, so that was day 2. What happens on day 2? The Egyptian armed forces, they're now in retreat in the Sinai. Well, they've got no air support, so they've got to leg it. So they're trying to get back to Egypt. They're trying to get over the Suez Canal. Jordan, still shelling, so the Jews and the Israelis have to think, well, we've got to stop the Jordanians, they keep shelling us. So they decide to have a ground attack obviously one of the problems was that they were shelling and shooting them from the old city of Jerusalem, which contains all of the holy sites of Judaism. So they decide to not use artillery and blow that all up, or air support. They decide to go in on foot, at least to try and stop it. But they get to they're looking at Jerusalem, the old city, but they're at some strategic positions around it. They control a lot of the West Bank area at this point, and they're at the gates of the old city of Jerusalem. And so this was I found this cartoon mildly amusing from the Washington Post. You see these are all of the countries of the world. Underneath they have like their banner, which is like "Forward Arabs" against Israel, but that's gone down, and now they're saying stop everybody, stop and withdraw, ceasefire. But you see, what was Israel supposed to do? God had arranged circumstances to the point where the situation was rolling forward, and it was almost impossible to stop it from a human perspective. This is a picture of Israelis going up a particular strategic area near Jerusalem called Ammunition Hill, where the British actually used to keep all their ammunitions, and that was a particularly bloody battle. But eventually, as we say, they're on Mount Scopus, and they're overlooking the old city. So they're pretty much surrounded the city of Jerusalem on day 2. They open the Scopus Road, and they've encircled the old city. And still inside the city, the Jordanians are shelling everybody, right? They don't care. They're just doing that. And this is one from The Guardian. Israel claims land and air success. And the British and the Americans are like, well, we're nothing to do with this. It's nothing to do with us, what's going on. Which is quite interesting considering what NASA says in a few days' time. So, here we go. That's day 2. This is day 3.
June 7th, 1967, day 3 of the war. The previous day, Israeli troops had reached the strategic high point of Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. They now overlooked the old city. For the last 19 years, Jerusalem had been divided. In 1948, Jordan had captured the eastern part of the city, which included the Old City and the Temple Mount, the location of the ancient Jewish temple, Judaism's holiest site. Under Jordanian rule, Jews were evicted from the Jewish quarter, synagogues were destroyed, and the Mount of Olives, Judaism's oldest and holiest cemetery, was vandalized. For 19 years, Jews had been barred from access to their holy sites in eastern Jerusalem, despite the rights promised in the 1949 Armistice Agreement. In the early morning of June 7th, the Israeli paratroopers advanced on the holy city. They advanced without artillery support, seeking to prevent damage to the city's ancient and historic sites. The battle lasted from early morning to the afternoon, when the announcement was made on the radio. Har Habayit Be'yadenu. The Temple Mount is in our hands. For the first time in 19 years, Jews could pray at the Western Wall. And for the first time in 2,000 years, a united Jerusalem, Judaism's holiest city, was back in sovereign Jewish hands. After capturing Jerusalem, the paratroopers moved south to reinforce other forces in the West Bank areas surrounding the city. The cities of Hebron, Bethlehem, and the region of Gush Etzion were captured with little to no resistance. The West Bank, the historical birthplace of the Jewish people, which until 1948 had maintained a Jewish presence for 3,000 years, was once again under Jewish control. The battle on the Eastern Front was virtually over, but in the north, the fighting continued.
That was day 3. That was the day when the Temple Mount stopped being in Gentile hands and became once again in Jewish hands. They also removed the blockade on the Gulf of Aqaba. This guy here is on the right is one of the Jewish generals, Moshe Dayan. He's just one of the most notable kind of generals in the Israeli army because of this eye patch that he wore. The Jews actually Israelis got through the Lion Gate, which you can see there. We went to Israel a few years back, and that was a photo I took. of the Lion Gate. So we're on the Mount of Olives here, looking down into the old city. You can see the old city walls, hopefully, just about there. And one of the most amazing little stories that you can find is around this guy, General Rabbi Shlomo Goren. He's an incredibly brave man. In fact, later when the Israelis go south, I think it was at Bethlehem, he went in literally on his own and took the keys from the keeper of Bethlehem, like without any other soldiers, because he had so much faith that God was working with Israel on this day. And he's there in the army. He's saying prayers at the Western Wall, an interesting character. And there they are on top of the Temple Mount. Can't believe it that they've done it. The famous picture of the Israeli soldiers at the Temple Mount, at the Western Wall, the first time in thousands of years that Jews had been at the place of the Temple after AD 70. And to celebrate 50 years, those three men came back again recently, and that's what they look like today. Obviously, they're a bit fitter back in the day, but hey, it's quite interesting. So this is what the newspaper said: "Old city, most of Sinai fall, Tiran opened." An amazing thing to have achieved, it would seem. So what happens? We'll just finish off with the
June 8th, 1967, day 4 of the war. During the first 3 days of the Six-Day War, Israel had neutralized the threats from Egypt in the south and Jordan in the east. The Egyptians were in retreat, as were Arab forces in the West Bank. But June 8th began with one of the most tragic accidents of the war. Israeli planes mistakenly attacked the USS Liberty, an American electronic surveillance ship sailing just offshore. The attack was called off as soon as the mistake was realized, but not before 34 American sailors were killed. Prime Minister Eshkol conveyed his profound condolences to the Americans. During the 19 years that Jordan controlled the West Bank, Israel's width at its narrowest was 9 miles. This made it possible for an attacking army to cut the country in half, rendering it defenseless and threatening the very existence of the Jewish state. It also made it possible for enemy forces to shell and bomb Israeli coastal cities like Tel Aviv from the hills of the West Bank. Now, with the West Bank in Jewish hands, Israeli-controlled territory was 44 miles wide. Still only an hour's drive, but an area of land that could be realistically defended. Israel now held both the coastal plain to the west of the hills and the Jordan Valley to the east, a desert and natural barrier between Israel and the countries of Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. But for many Israelis and Jews around the world, the West Bank was much more than just territory needed for security. It was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Also known by the biblical names of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank was the home of the Jewish patriarchs of the Bible, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It had been central to Jewish identity and had maintained continuous Jewish presence for 3,000 years. The fact that it was now under the control of a Jewish state was deeply moving for many people worldwide. Throughout the day, Israeli forces consolidated their control of the West Bank, an area that was home to 600,000 Arab residents. Meanwhile, in the south, Israeli forces pushed towards the Suez Canal, leading Egypt to accept a ceasefire late that night. In the north, however, Syrian artillery bombardment continued all along the border. Israel now moved to focus its forces on Syria.
Okay, so day 4, the Egyptian forces, right, they're in retreat in the Sinai, they've got no air support, and so Israel decides to keep mopping them up, basically. Pretty awful. Syria's bombing from the north. The Jordanians are pretty much crushed at this stage, and so Israel has to act, and so they go into the Sinai. There's massive tank battles, all sorts of things. Eventually, the Egyptians admit defeat and say, "Hey, well, let's have a ceasefire." This is kind of what happens. So you'll notice here that the Israelis they come down to the south. They get rid of the block there in the Gulf of Aqaba, and they come up and they kind of all the Egyptian forces are fleeing across, and some of them are cut off by the Israelis who come and basically cut them off. They've got no air support, some pretty awful scenes of the Egyptian tanks in some of the areas getting completely and utterly obliterated. This is some Jewish tanks that are setting out on that campaign. And just like mile after mile of Egyptians just completely destroyed, like against all the odds. Burnt out ashes of the might of the Egyptian force. When you go to Israel, you can spend many a happy hour, as my wife will tell you, going around places like Latron, where they have some of the tanks that actually took place in these wars. That's what's called a Sherman tank. These were quite old school tanks, but the Israelis had refitted them with kind of more up-to-date equipment. But in essence, they were still like World War II tanks that were being used in 1967. So we've got here Tank Battle Smashes Nasser's armoured force from the Jerusalem Post. Now,
June 9th, 1967, day 5 of the war. Throughout the war, Egyptian media had been falsely reporting of military successes against Israel. But on June 9th, Egyptian President Nasser appeared on national television, revealed the truth about Egypt's defeat, and resigned. In an effort to shift blame, Nasser falsely claimed that American and British aircraft assisted the Israelis and that the enemy was operating with an air force 3 times stronger than his normal force. Following an outpouring of support for Nasser, he retracted his resignation the next day. Egypt and Jordan were defeated, and now Israel finally turned north to Syria. For decades, Syria regularly shelled northern Israeli cities, villages, and communities from the Syrian-controlled Golan Heights. The high ground of the Golan overlooking northern Israel gave Syria the upper hand. Since 1949, more than 1,000 rockets and shells had rained down on Israel. Terrorists regularly infiltrated Israel's border, carrying out attacks against civilians. More than 120 had lost their lives. This intolerable situation put the people of northern Israel in constant danger. The Israeli Defense Forces moved on the slopes of the Golan Heights at 11:30 a.m., reaching the first line of steel and concrete Syrian posts. By the end of the day, Israeli forces held all the roads and access points to the Golan, but they did not yet hold the high ground. Israel's north was still under threat.
okay, so Nasser, this guy, he's a bit of a clown really, isn't he? He resigns, blaming that the British and the Americans were with the Israelis, lying through his teeth. And then, this is the leader who basically started this war, and he's like, oh, we're losing, so I'm going to now quit. You know, he left his country, as it were, in the middle of this crisis. So anyway, everyone says, no, don't do it. So then he's like, oh, okay. And then he gets back into power. So the Battle of the Golan begins. Now, when you go to Israel, this is the area called Tel Dan, where they've got the ancient remains of the ancient city of Dan. And to the north of that area is this is Mount Hermon, and this is the area that the Syrians had, and that's literally looking level. So this is you can see how high up the Golan Heights are. So if you've got a gun on top of one of those kind of really high ridges, very easy for you to pepper or anyone coming up. So that's what they were doing, and so the Jews were in their bomb shelters regularly in the north. When you go there today, this is at the foot of Mount Hermon. This is you can still see some of the trenches that were around from '67. In fact, you might recognise that handsome, strapping man, or their boy. And we went on an adventure through some of these trenches, which you can see is pretty dark and dingy. That's like a rack where they used to put guns and stuff. There's an old bed still around. You know, these things are still quite fresh in historical terms. So a ceasefire was accepted, and I think that's actually not the right timing, but bear with me, that's better. The Egyptians were trapped in Sinai. Some of the pincher movement that the Israelis had done had just kind of completely trapped them, and they got destroyed, a lot of the tanks, and so they accept this situation. So now this is on to day 6. We're nearly there, everybody.
June 10th, 1967, day 6 of the war. Although Egypt's and Jordan's armed forces had been defeated, Syria continued to shell Israel from the Golan Heights in the north. The battle for control of the Golan Heights had begun the previous day. On June 10th, the Israeli Defense Forces made its bid for the high ground. As ceasefire discussions progressed in the UN, Prime Minister Eshkol refused to accept a situation where Syria would still be able to terrorize the north and ordered the Israeli forces to push forward in order to fully neutralize the threat. The Syrian forces now began to disintegrate, with officers and soldiers alike abandoning their posts. By midday, Quneitra, the last Syrian stronghold, fell. The entire Golan Heights was now in Israel's hands. The war was over. The losses on the Arab side had been catastrophic. Just a week earlier, 200,000 Arab soldiers and 1,000 tanks were positioned to carry out their leaders' pledges to destroy the Jewish state. Now, these forces were defeated and thousands of Arab soldiers were lost in battle. The result was humiliation and anger throughout the Arab world, as Israel had established itself as the dominant military power in the region. Facing aggression from its neighboring countries, Israel had captured the Golan Heights from Syria, preventing Syria from terrorizing communities in northern Israel. It had captured eastern Jerusalem and the West Bank from Jordan, giving Israel the strategic high ground as well as a more defensible width at its narrowest point. Israel also took control of the entire Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, preventing the threat of Egyptian attacks on Israel's borders and opening Israel's southern port. For the first time, Israel had strategic depth. Israel was swept by a wave of euphoria. The small, strongly outnumbered country had achieved a stunning military victory and greatly increased its size to borders that could be realistically defended. It had removed the sense of constant threat of annihilation that Israelis had faced ever since the establishment of the state 19 years earlier. And perhaps most acutely felt was the sense of national and historical rebirth, as Jerusalem, Judaism's holiest place and capital of the ancient Jewish kingdom, was reunited under Jewish sovereignty for the first time in 2,000 years.
So, final day, they take out the Golan Heights, the war ends. Just a reminder of the stats, pretty amazing really. It was like a David and Goliath moment, wasn't it, with the odds completely stacked against Israel. And I think if you can't see the amazing hand of God in that, I think you've got to be pretty blind and attribute some phenomenal intelligence to human beings on the Israeli side to be able to do that. In fact, so much so that even people in the world, they called it a miracle. The six-day miracle was one of the things. The Jews themselves saw it as a miracle. These are from Jewish magazines. 7 days ago, we wrote that the Jewish people cannot rely on miracles, but what has happened since then cannot be adequately comprehended in any other terms. Manifestations of the supernatural. Bullets were going around corners, so to speak, in that war. We've only sort of scraped the surface. There's plenty of books on some of the battles that took place and some of the amazing feats. What about the Christadelphian community? Well, afterwards, there was plenty of articles, as you can imagine, in the Christadelphian magazine. This one from James Carter called Wake, Brethren, Wake. Says, let us confess, when we saw that ring of enemies, jackals intent upon devouring the carcass of their enemy, and knowing the military support of Russia to these countries, we thought it hardly possible that Israel could survive such a combined onslaught, especially in view of the latest equipment from Russia of the Arab nations. And what happened? One of the greatest miracles in history. I think we can sit here 50 years later and go, oh yeah, of course. But imagine, you're living there. When was the last time you spoke to a brother who attributed a political event to a miracle in recent times? I can't imagine very much. Maybe the Tarshish stuff. But really, this is amazing. Absolutely amazing. I'm not going to read all of this. A bit later on in July, so this all happened in June, in the July edition of the Christadelphian magazine in 1967, there was kind of a report on a special lecture that took place, The Bible in the Middle East, at Birmingham Town Hall. It said 2,000 people filled all the available space in the town hall, and some 300 more listened to a relay in the basement. It is believed that about 300 were visitors drawn in by these things. Amazing! 2,000 people. You think, like, we've got 50 here and we're happy that 50 people have come to think about these things. 2,000. I'm kind of gutted. Where's everybody else? You know. In 1987, some years later, Brother Alan Eyre was reflecting on an article that Brother Michael Ashton of Woodgate Meeting now had written on the Six-Day War. And he writes in and he says about this, that Birmingham wasn't the only place where the number of visitors kind of were into the hundreds. He says that he was in Jamaica and 1,000 people came to one of his. That's in Jamaica, and 400 at a second talk. So just see the amount of interest and enthusiasm from the Brotherhood to put these talks on, and then the enthusiasm from those outside to come to these talks. This is in Gloucester. They did one. The Bible and the Middle East, God's Purpose in the Holy Land. They did their special effort. Bournemouth did a special effort. They said they had about 800 people there, of whom at least 300 were interested friends. Bristol Down End. Are you from Bristol Down End? Is anyone from Bristol Down End? Bristol Down End, they did one. They said they had 230 people there, 30 strangers came. This is amazing, it's unprecedented to have like this kind of in the intelligence sections of the Christadelphian. All these ecclesias were saying, hey, we've got to put a special effort on this. This is a momentous occasion. Chesterfield had one. 12 visitors, 100 brethren and sisters. Melbourne, over in Australia, they had one. And they had about 300 people there. You could just keep going. Durban in South Africa, they had H.T. Mansfield over. He gave some talks. They had quite a few visitors, around 200 overall. In the Testimony magazine, articles went out. There is a proverb in Israel: he who does not believe in miracles in Israel is not a realist. Within 3 hours after hostilities commenced on the morning of Monday, the Egyptian Air Force lay in smoking ruins. So the Brotherhood, they were dead excited. Now, we asked Brother Paul Billington if he could bring over some copies of this special edition of the Bible magazine. If you don't subscribe to the Bible magazine, can I put a shameless plug in for the Bible magazine? It's well worth getting. I kind of think that it's like the Christadelphian version of OK Magazine, right? Not because of the weird stuff of OK Magazine, but because it's like full of pictures, it's very exciting, and full of great stuff to study. So in this particular, not that OK Magazine has any of those things, but you know what I mean, full of pictures is the only connection there, right? From July 2014, there was a special edition all around Jerusalem Day. And one of the things that is very interesting in there is some of the prints from Christadelphian advertising of the time that you can have a look at. I'm not going to go through that now, but Brother Paul kindly brought some, and we've put them at the back, so anyone can take one of those away and have a read in your spare time. Now, two kind of final little videos just to kind of set things up for our final talk this evening about what happened just after the war, and then we'll leave it there. Okay? 2.
After the war, Israel found itself in control of both land and population that it had no intention of governing before being thrust into war. Israel now controlled territory with about 950,000 mostly Muslim Arab residents. It now held the Temple Mount, the holiest site to the Jewish people, but also the site of a sacred Muslim mosque and shrine, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. In an unprecedented and controversial effort to promote peace and avoid further conflict, Israel turned over control of the Temple Mount and its Muslim sites to the Jordanians only 10 days after the war ended. The Israeli government also sent a message to the Arab countries through the U.S., saying that it was willing to give up territory for peace. But the Israelis received no answer. This would be one of many unreciprocated gestures of peace. 3 months after the war, the Arab leaders met in Khartoum, Sudan, to discuss their next steps. They agreed upon a resolution that came to be known as the 3 No's of Khartoum. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. Israel's foreign minister Abba Eban later said, This is the first war in history which has ended with the victors suing for peace and the vanquished calling for unconditional surrender. Israelis were dismayed. They had hoped that their victory would open up an avenue to peace negotiations in which captured land would be traded for genuine peace with its neighbors. Instead, they were confronted by a flat refusal to negotiate for peace around any borders, the same position that preceded the war and one that most Arab countries and groups were to hold for decades after the war. Despite this history of strong rejection of Israel, later developments did lead to peace between Israel and some Arab countries, as we will see in the final film of this series. On the eve of the Six-Day War, in June 1967, more than 200,000 Arab troops and 1,000 tanks were positioned near Israel's borders, threatening to destroy the Jewish state. During the war, Israel pushed back the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and captured territory that had been used to attack and threaten Israel. Immediately after the war, Israel signaled that it would give up captured territory for peace, but the Arab countries refused to recognize or negotiate with the State of Israel. 5 months after the Six-Day War, the United Nations passed Resolution 242, calling on Israel to withdraw from captured territories without specifying how much, while also calling on its neighbors to end aggression against Israel and to recognize its right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries. This came to be known as the Land for Peace formula. Israel was willing to part with newly captured territories in the Sinai, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and even the West Bank, despite its historical significance for the Jewish people, in return for peace. Again, the Arab states refused to negotiate peace. However, 12 years later, following another unsuccessful war launched by Arab states, and after many rounds of diplomacy, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat signed a peace treaty with Israel. In return for peace, Israel withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula, nearly 90% of the area it captured in the Six-Day War. 15 years later, in 1994, Israel also signed a peace treaty with Jordan. For the Arabs who live in the West Bank and Gaza, the last 50 years have been difficult. While there has never been a Palestinian state, the dream of achieving one has only grown during this time. However, for decades following the Six-Day War, Palestinian leaders rejected living alongside Israel. They believed that all of the land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which includes all of Israel, belonged to them. Hopes soared during the 1990s when the Oslo peace process seemed to offer a negotiated path to a Palestinian state and peace with Israel. Some important progress was made by setting up an elected government for Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, that governs daily life for most Palestinians to this day. The Oslo process led to the Camp David summit in 2000, where Israel offered the Palestinian Authority a two-state solution. Had the Palestinians accepted this proposal, a Palestinian state would have been created in the West Bank and Gaza, with eastern Jerusalem as its capital. But hopes for peace were dashed once again with the Palestinian Intifada of the early 2000s, when Palestinian suicide bombers and terrorists attacked Israelis in restaurants and buses, killing more than 700 Israeli civilians. In 2005, in another attempt to end the violence and foster peace, Israel unilaterally withdrew all Israeli forces and Jewish communities from the Gaza Strip. This involved uprooting some 8,000 Jews from their homes, an operation that was very difficult for many Israelis. But less than 2 years later, the terrorist group Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in a military coup and has since fired more than 12,000 rockets and mortars at Israeli communities. This experience has discouraged most Israelis from wanting to make further unilateral withdrawals. In response to these terrorist attacks, Israel has taken steps to protect its citizens with security barriers, checkpoints, arrests, and other measures that have decreased attacks. Israelis are aware that these have come at a cost for the vast majority of Palestinians who are not involved in terrorism. There is an ongoing debate in Israel about the best way to protect human rights and stop terrorism. Today, most Israelis say they prefer a solution of two states for two peoples. For the sake of real peace, most are willing to take very difficult steps, such as turning over control of most of the West Bank to the Palestinians and ending what some refer to as the occupation. Most are even willing to uproot many of the Jewish communities or settlements in the West Bank, also known by the biblical names of Judea and Samaria, an area that has deep historical and religious significance to many Jews around the world. Yet at the same time, most Israelis have serious doubts that the current Palestinian leadership will ever accept living alongside the Jewish state of Israel. Many Israelis point to the Palestinian leadership's ongoing acts of honoring and celebrating Palestinian terrorists. They also point to Hamas and Palestinian Authority school curricula that deny the existence of Israel. These curricula focus on a return to an exclusively Palestinian homeland in place of Israel. There is a broad consensus in Israel that the strategic depth earned in the Six-Day War, a legitimate war of defense, should not be given up without strong peace agreements. Peace agreements that end the conflict with the Palestinians and the Arab countries and preserve Israel as both a democracy and the nation-state of the Jewish people. Today, in this chaotic and increasingly radicalized Middle East, Israel remains the one stable democracy with thriving Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities. Israelis take pride in their vibrant and diverse culture, their passion for repairing and improving the world, their many accomplishments in the areas of medicine, science, technology, and the arts, and most of all, their role in carrying forward the 3,000-year-old heritage of the Jewish people.
So, that's it. In the final study, this evening, God willing, we're going to have a look at the continued significance of events that have unfolded since the Six-Day War and to look forward to the future. And hopefully we're going to cement a little bit more of the reasoning behind why it's so important that we as Christadelphians appreciate what's happening with the nation of Israel. But I just wanted to say, don't you think it is absolutely amazing that that took place? Like, the Israelis didn't intend to get Jerusalem in that Six-Day War. Even right up to the last few hours before they actually went in, they didn't intend to do it. But God created that situation so that the prophecies that we looked at in our first session would be indeed fulfilled, and that the Jews would be in Jerusalem ready for the manifestation of the Lord Jesus Christ and his saints at the time that we all look for.